He had been watching her for 11 days before he decided to become someone else. That was how long it took. 11 days of standing in his own hallway, in his own house, watching a woman work. Watching the way she moved through rooms that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Touching nothing she had not been asked to touch. Taking nothing she had not been given, speaking only when spoken to, and even then with a brevity so complete it bordered on music. 11 days of that, and still the thing in his chest that he could not name refused to settle. James Whitmore had made his money the way most men of his generation who were honest about it would admit. Partly through intelligence, partly through timing, and largely through the specific kind of ruthlessness that only looks like ambition from the outside. By the time he was 47, he owned a property development company with offices in 4 cities, a house in the hills above town with 14 rooms he had not all entered, and a reputation for being the kind of employer who could identify a person's hidden motivation within the first hour of any meeting. He had built an entire career on reading people. He trusted his instincts the way other men trusted contracts. He had not been able to read Margaret Adeyemi. She had come to him through an agency, references impeccable. 8 years with a family in the north of the city, left when they relocated abroad, came with letters of recommendation that used words like irreplaceable and quiet authority, and a dignity that makes you feel better about your own house. He had read the letters twice, which he did not usually do. He had offered her the position without the second interview he conducted with every other applicant, because something in the way she sat in the chair across from him, upright, without stiffness, with the perfect posture of a person who has learned that their body is the one thing entirely their own, told him that whatever she was not performing it. That should have been enough. For any other employer, it would have been enough. But 3 weeks into her employment, his fiancée Carolyn had come to him with what she called a concern. She had come in the evening, when Margaret had gone home, and she had sat across from him at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and a carefully arranged expression of reluctant honesty, and she had said, "I think she goes through things, James, when I'm not watching. I think she takes her time in rooms she shouldn't." He had asked for specifics. Carolyn had produced none. She had spoken instead about instincts, about something in the way Margaret looked at certain surfaces, about a feeling she could not shake. He had sat with it overnight, and in the morning he had told himself it was nothing. Carolyn had always been uneasy with household staff, had grown up in a family that kept its doors locked against the help, carried a particular kind of class suspicion she had never examined closely enough to dismantle. But the thing in his chest had not settled. And James Whitmore, who trusted his instincts above almost everything else, had turned that instinct inward and decided to create a test. Not the kind of test a reasonable man would design, not a quiet review of inventory, not a conversation with the agency, not a straightforward request for information. No, the test he designed was the kind that revealed more about the person administering it than about the person taking it, though he would not understand that for some time. He told Margaret that he had suffered a significant financial reversal. He told her on a Tuesday morning, standing in his own kitchen in a shirt he had worn 2 days in a row on purpose, with a posture he manufactured to look like the particular deflation of a man who has been reduced. He said it quietly, with the studied understatement of someone embarrassed by the truth. The company had encountered difficulties. The assets were under review. He was going to need to make some adjustments to the household. He said he was very sorry to be telling her this, that he understood if she needed to look elsewhere, that he would provide her whatever reference she needed. He watched her face. He had watched 100 faces in negotiation across 100 boardroom tables. He had watched faces do every possible thing a face can do when money enters or leaves a room. Margaret Adeyemi's face did something he had not expected. It did nothing at all. Not the nothing of shock. Not the nothing of performance. The nothing of someone who has heard hard news before and has developed, through practice, the particular grace of not making someone else's difficulty about themselves. She was quiet for a moment. She folded the cloth she had been holding with the same slow, deliberate care she brought to everything her hands did. "Are you all right?" she said. He had not been prepared for that question. He had prepared himself for several others. Questions about severance, about the time frame, about references. He had not prepared for the question of whether he was all right. Asked in a voice that was not performing sympathy but simply offering it, the way you offer someone a chair when they look like they need one. "I'll manage," he said. "Is there anything you need me to do differently while you're working through it?" she asked. He told her no. He told her to carry on as she had been. He watched her nod once, fold the cloth a final time, and return to the room she had been cleaning. That night he sat in his study and held the fiction he had constructed around himself like a coat that no longer fit. And he tried to determine what he had learned. What he had learned was not what he had intended to learn. He had intended to learn whether her behavior would change, whether the attentiveness would slacken, whether small things would disappear, whether she would begin looking for advantages in a household she believed was weakening. Instead, he had learned that her first response to a man's declared misfortune was to ask whether he was all right. And he did not know what to do with that. He made the fiction worse. Over the following 4 days, he removed things. He had the expensive car replaced in the driveway by a second-hand sedan borrowed from his assistant's brother. He switched from the pressed shirts to older clothes, creased and slightly worn at the collar. He let the refrigerator thin out, not empty, but noticeably less than it had been. The kind of refrigerator that tells a careful observer that something has changed in the household economy. He canceled the florist delivery. He ate at the kitchen table instead of the dining room, which he had read somewhere was what people of modest means did, and which he found he actually preferred, though he filed that observation away and did not examine it. Margaret noticed. He could see that she noticed, because she was the kind of person whose noticing was very quiet and very complete. She said nothing about it. She did not change her pace or her thoroughness. She cleaned the rooms she had always cleaned with the same attention she had always brought to them. But twice during that week, James came home to find that she had done something small and additional and unrequested. The kitchen shelves had been reorganized so that the items he used daily were at the front and easier to reach. A loose hinge on the pantry door, loose for months, something he had never mentioned, had been tightened with a screwdriver she had found somewhere in the house and returned to wherever she'd found it. Not mentioned. Not noted in any log. Simply done. On the 5th day, he came home earlier than expected. He let himself in through the side entrance quietly, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to walk through his own house unannounced, an old habit from the early days of the business, when he had learned that a company looks different when no one knows the owner is watching. He came through the hall and stopped. Margaret was sitting on the floor of the utility corridor outside the kitchen, not working, sitting with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, her phone held loosely in both hands. She was speaking quietly, and for a moment he could not make out the words, and then he could. "I know, baby," she was saying. "I know the doctor said Wednesday. I know. Listen to me. The Wednesday appointment is the important one, so whatever happens, don't move that one. Keep the Tuesday if you can, because the results will be back by then and Dr. Inane will want to see them before he talks to you." A pause. "I'm going to come as soon as my shift ends. I'll take the 6 o'clock. Don't eat before you go tomorrow. They said nothing after midnight, remember? Nothing. Another pause. Shorter. I love you. Go sleep now. She ended the call and sat there for a moment with her eyes closed, doing something that was not quite breathing and not quite holding herself still, but somewhere between the two. Then she opened her eyes. She saw him. She did not startle. She did not explain herself. She stood up, tucked her phone into her apron pocket, and said, "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. I should have taken that outside." "Don't apologize," he said. Then, because he was still operating within his fiction and had not yet found the exit, "Is everything all right?" "My mother has a procedure coming up," she said. "She lives about an hour from here. She manages on her own most of the time, but I like to be there for the medical appointments. I hope she recovers well," he said. "Thank you," she said, and returned to the kitchen. He stood in the utility corridor for a moment after she had gone, feeling the particular discomfort of a man who has been performing something in front of a person who turned out to be real. He accelerated the fiction in the wrong direction entirely. He told her on Monday that he was going to have to let her go at the end of the month, that the household adjustments had reached a point where he could no longer sustain the position. He said it with the same studied understatement as before, and he watched her face again. She looked at him, not at the middle distance, not at the floor, at him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I want to say something, and I hope you'll allow me to say it plainly." "Go ahead," he said. "I have worked in 7 houses over 20 years, she said. "I have worked for people who had more money than they would ever spend in 3 lifetimes, and I have worked for people who were managing, and I have worked for people in real difficulty. I am telling you this not to presume anything about your situation, because your situation is your business. I am telling you because I want you to know that the standard I bring to this work does not change with the circumstances of the house. It is mine. It goes where I go. And if the time comes when you genuinely cannot sustain this position, I will leave without complaint and with gratitude for the time I was here. But I want you to know that before I go." She smoothed her apron with one flat hand. "That is all I wanted to say," she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a room after a window has been opened. The air changed, and the changed air was better than what had been there before. James Whitmore looked at the woman standing in his kitchen in the house that cost more than she would earn in 40 years of work, delivering a small, complete, philosophically devastating speech about the nature of professional dignity, and he understood with absolute clarity that he had been wrong. Not only about her, about the test, about the design of the test, the logic of the test, the assumption beneath the test that some people need to be tricked into revealing what they are, when in fact what they are has been visible in every room they have ever entered, to anyone patient enough to look. He did not tell her the truth that day. He held it for 3 more days, which was the wrong choice, and he understood it was the wrong choice while he was making it. But something in him needed to understand the full picture before he could speak, and the full picture, when it finally assembled itself, did not include the element he had expected. He found Carolyn in his study on Thursday evening, at his desk, reading something on his laptop that she had opened without being invited to. He stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her close the laptop with the specific speed of a person who was not expecting the door to open. She smiled at him. The smile landed approximately 1 second late. "I was just checking something," she said. He nodded. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair across from his own desk, which felt like the correct symbolic position for what was about to happen, and he asked her, very calmly, what she had been looking at. She told him email. He asked whose. She paused and said hers. He pointed out that his laptop was not linked to her email account. The pause that followed was not long enough to have been a pause in which she was thinking of the truth. It was the length of a pause in which someone is selecting between available fictions and discarding the ones that won't hold. He had received a call that morning from his property manager at the city offices. The manager had mentioned, in passing, that a woman had called the office the previous week asking questions about a specific asset under James's name, a residential property in the east of the city, currently leased to a charitable housing trust for a nominal fee, an arrangement James had made 4 years ago as a quietly private thing he had told almost no one about. The woman who had called had identified herself as his representative. She had asked questions about the lease value relative to market rate. The property manager had not thought much of it until this morning, when James had called about something unrelated and mentioned it in passing. And James, standing at his office window looking out at the city in which he owned a great many things, had felt the pieces move under him like a very slow, very quiet earthquake. Carolyn had not been concerned about Margaret. She had been concerned about the asset profile she had glimpsed over his shoulder during a dinner party 6 weeks ago, and the specific question of what a wealthy man who appeared to be experiencing financial difficulty might be persuaded to do with properties that were currently generating below-market returns. He looked at her now across his own desk, and he saw it with the clarity that he had spent 47 years developing the capacity to see things with. Carolyn had not loved him. She had been in the process of assessing him. The suspicion she had pointed at Margaret, the concern about rooms she shouldn't enter, things she shouldn't touch, was a projection of something she understood from the inside. She had known exactly how to position it. She had used the vocabulary of protectiveness, of loyalty, of a partner looking out for a partner's interests, and underneath every word of it had been something as cold and functional as a balance sheet. The assessment of a woman who had looked at his assets and his habits and his loneliness and had decided, with the specific patience of the calculating, that what she was building was worth tending carefully until it was ready to be harvested. And she had very nearly succeeded. She had very nearly turned him against the one person in the house who had given him nothing but honesty. He had nearly fired Margaret Adeyemi. He had stood in his kitchen in a deliberately worn shirt and manufactured a crisis, and watched her respond to it with grace, and delivered an even worse fiction on top of the first one, and watched her respond to that with something better than grace. And he had done all of it because a woman who had been deceiving him since the 3rd week of their relationship had pointed a finger at the one person in the house who had not. He asked her to leave. She did not leave quietly. She left the way people leave when they have been caught before they were ready, with a volume that was intended to reframe the situation, and a set of accusations that were specifically designed to make him doubt the thing he had just understood. He sat through it with his hands flat on the arms of the chair. He let it finish. He said nothing that was not necessary. When the door closed behind her, the house was quiet in a way that felt earned. He sat alone for a long time that evening. He thought about a woman who had folded a cloth before asking whether he was all right. He thought about a loose hinge tightened without mention. He thought about a phone call in a utility corridor. A voice saying nothing after midnight. Remember, with the specific tenderness of someone who has been managing a difficult situation for a long time and has become very good at managing it efficiently, because efficiency is what love looks like when resources are short. He thought about 20 years and 7 houses, and a standard she carried with her like a piece of her own furniture, irreducible, non-negotiable, entirely hers. He thought about what he had put her through. He had manufactured a lie and delivered it to a person who had told him nothing but the truth, and he had watched her respond to that lie with grace, and he had manufactured a worse lie and watched her respond to that one with something better than grace, with a quiet, complete 2-paragraph statement about the nature of professional dignity that he had not been able to stop thinking about for 72 hours, and he had called all of it a test, as though testing a person's character is a neutral act, as though it does not cost the person being tested something real. He called her in the morning. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She said nothing. He took that as permission. He told her everything. He told her about Carolyn's concern, and how he had chosen to respond to it, and what he had invented, and why, and what had happened instead of what he had expected to happen. He told her what he had discovered about Carolyn. He told her about the asset inquiry. He told her that the financial difficulty he had described was fiction, and that the position she held in his household was in no danger, and had never been. He said all of it in the same order it had happened, without softening any of it, because the sequence was the point. He needed her to understand the full architecture of what he had constructed in his own kitchen, while she had been tightening a hinge she had not been asked to tighten. When he finished, she was quiet. The quiet lasted long enough that he thought the call had dropped. "My mother's procedure is on Wednesday," she said finally. "The surgeon says it is routine, but my mother is 73, and nothing at 73 is entirely routine." "I'm sorry," he said. "Is there anything I'm telling you?" she said. "Because you told me the truth, and I think the truth should go in both directions." A pause. "I have managed. I have always managed. I am not telling you so that you will do something. I am telling you because you asked, at the beginning of all of this, whether everything was all right, and the honest answer is that it is not, quite. But it will be." He sat with that for a moment. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said, "I owe you a genuine apology, and I will make one properly when you're ready to hear it in person. But I also want to make you a genuine offer. And I want to be clear that the offer is not the apology. They are two separate things, and neither one earns the other." He told her about the household management role he had been thinking about for 2 years, but had never acted on. A position overseeing staff and operations across his 3 personal properties, with a salary that was 3 times what she was currently earning, with medical benefits that extended to immediate family. He told her it was a real role that needed a real person, and that he had not offered it to anyone yet, because he had not met anyone he was sure of. He said he was sure of her. He said he had been sure since the day she sat across from him in the chair and did not perform a single thing. She did not answer immediately. She said she would think about it. She said she would let him know after Wednesday. He said that was more than fair. He said he hoped Wednesday went well. He said it and meant it with a directness he was not accustomed to. The directness of a man who has recently had a significant number of his habitual defenses removed by a woman who did not raise her voice once. Wednesday came and went. On Thursday morning, Margaret Adeyemi called him from the hospital waiting room while her mother was still in recovery, and accepted the position. She had 2 requests. The first was that one of the medical benefits provisions be extended to cover home care visits for elderly parents of staff, not just her mother, but any member of the household team whose aging parent needed support. She said she knew what it was to manage that kind of distance on a salary that did not allow for taxis, or for taking days off, or for anything that could not be planned precisely weeks in advance. She said she did not want that to be someone else's private difficulty when it could be a policy. He said yes before she had finished the sentence. The second request was smaller and larger at the same time. She asked whether she could bring her mother to the house once the recovery was complete, not to stay, just to visit. She said her mother had spent her whole life curious about the houses her daughter worked in and had never been inside one. She said she thought her mother would like to see the garden, which Margaret had described to her several times. He said yes to that too. And then he said something he had not planned to say, but which came out with the ease of something true. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said, "bring her whenever she likes. Tell her the garden is open." The household changed after that, in the way that things change when something that was slightly wrong is corrected, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a note held slightly off pitch is adjusted, and the whole chord resolves. Margaret moved between the three properties with the same unhurried thoroughness she had always brought to the first one. The staff she oversaw, 4 people across the properties, responded to her with the particular respect that is not performed for a superior, but given freely to someone whose competence is obvious and whose manner makes it easy to be honest. A loose tile in the East Properties kitchen, unreported for 3 months, was noted in her first week and repaired the week after. A billing discrepancy with a maintenance contractor, overlooked for a year, was identified and recovered. Small things. The kind of things that are small until you calculate what they cost over time. Carolyn did not call. Her cousin, who had worked in James's city offices for 18 months, submitted a resignation 2 weeks later with no stated reason, and James did not ask for one. On the first Saturday of the month following, James's housekeeper at the Hill property, an older man named Edward, who had been with the estate for 9 years and had the particular quiet loyalty of someone who had been in service his whole working life, set the garden table with the good china without being asked to. He arranged the chairs so that the afternoon light came from the best angle. He placed a vase of garden flowers at the center, which was not something he typically did for ordinary Saturday afternoons, and when James asked about it, Edward said simply, "Mrs. Adeyemi's mother is coming today, sir. I thought it should look well." James looked at the table. The light was falling across it in exactly the right way. The flowers were something from the garden wall, unpretentious and very clean. "Good thinking, Edward," he said. He was still in the garden when the car arrived. He watched Margaret help her mother out of the passenger seat, a small woman, 73, moving carefully on her feet with the deliberateness of someone who has recently been reminded that her body requires negotiation. She wore a hat. She looked at the house the way someone looks at something they have imagined for a long time and are now measuring against the imagination. She said something to Margaret that James could not hear from the garden, and Margaret laughed. A real laugh. The kind that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives, and took her mother's arm, and they walked together toward the garden door. He stepped forward to meet them. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said to the older woman. "Welcome. I'm glad you're here." She looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who has spent 7 decades deciding who is worth trusting and has gotten very good at it. She looked at her daughter, then back at him. "My Margaret says you are a fair man," she said. Eventually he felt something shift in his chest and settle. "She is being generous," he said. "She is always generous," the older woman said. "That is her difficulty and her gift. Come, show me this garden she has been telling me about since the spring." They sat at the table for 2 hours. Edward brought tea and did not hover. The afternoon light did exactly what it had been arranged to do. Margaret's mother told a story about the house she grew up in a country James had visited once on business and now found he wished he had paid more attention to. And James listened with the genuine attention of a man who had recently learned that listening is a more complex skill than he had given it credit for. Margaret sat between them, occasionally translating a reference her mother made that James's context could not decode, occasionally saying nothing and simply being present, which James was beginning to understand was its own form of care. The curtain at the sitting room window shifted once. In a breeze that was barely there, and it moved the afternoon light across the garden table in a way that lasted only a moment, and then was still. James noticed it. Margaret's mother noticed it too, and she glanced upward with the brief, private expression of someone who has learned to receive small signs without making much of them in front of others. She patted her daughter's hand. Nothing was said. If you have ever been tested by someone who did not trust you enough to simply ask, if you have ever been watched and assessed and measured by someone who had already decided what they were looking for before they began to look, then you know that the test says almost nothing about you and a very great deal about the person who designed it. Character is not revealed by being observed. It is simply present in every room it enters, whether anyone is looking or not. The room knows. The hinge knows. The folded cloth knows. And here is what the test could never have measured. Because no test designed by a man like James Whitmore, built on suspicion, on the architecture of doubt, on the assumption that goodness needs to be earned in front of an audience before it can be believed, could have reached it. Margaret Adeyemi had not changed her standard, because she believed she was being watched. She had not tightened the hinge in order to be seen tightening it. She had done it because a loose hinge is a loose hinge, and she was the kind of person who, upon noticing a thing that needed doing, did it, without calculating whether doing it would be noticed or rewarded or returned. That is not virtue performed. That is character. The difference between the two is the whole of the distance between a person who is good and a person who plays at goodness when the stakes are high enough. What James Whitmore had set out to find with his fiction and his borrowed sedan and his deliberately thinned refrigerator was something he already had access to every Tuesday and Friday morning: the plain, unperforming, entirely ordinary truth of who Margaret Adeyemi was. He had simply been looking through the wrong end of the instrument. Some people spend their whole lives being underestimated by people who call it caution. They carry their dignity through house after house, city after city, situation after situation, and they do not perform it for anyone, because it was never for anyone's benefit but their own. They tighten the hinges. They organize the shelves. They ask whether you are all right before they ask about their own situation, not because they have been trained to, but because that is the shape of the thing they carry. And sometimes, not always, not often enough, but sometimes, someone finally pays attention. The garden table sat in afternoon light that was almost gone. Margaret's mother had fallen into a light sleep in her chair, the way old people do, completely and without apology, her hands folded in her lap and her hat still perfectly on. Margaret watched her with an expression that had no name in any language James knew. The expression of someone looking at the whole of their life gathered into one sleeping face. He looked away, because some things are not for watching. He looked at the garden instead, at what had been there all along, in ordinary light, unperforming and entirely itself. That was enough. For today, and for all the days after, that was exactly enough.